Welcome to the familiar faces and the less familiar faces. Shabbat Shalom, and a special welcome to our guest, Chazanit Zahava Fried, leading services us this morning. It's a little bit different for us, but beautiful. Just a short and, I think, particularly resonant teaching this morning on Parashat Acharei Mot. A teaching based on a verse that introduces all of the forbidden relationships that you saw mentioned at the end of the Torah reading. All of the forbidden relationships are preceded by a general warning, K'ma'aseh eretz Mitzrayim asher yashavtem ba lo ta'asu. Don't do the deeds that they did in Egypt where you dwelled. Uchema'aseh eretz Canaan asher ani mevi etchem shama lo ta'asu. And don't do the deeds that they do in the land of Canaan, to the place I am bringing you. Now, there are no superfluous words in the Torah, right? Every word has a purpose. So why does the Torah say, don't do the things they do or they did in the place in Egypt where you dwelled? Why didn't the Torah just say, don't do what they did in Egypt and don't do what they do in Canaan? What is the meaning of these words, where you dwelled? So this is a famous question, and Rashi gives a very strange and surprising explanation. Rashi's a great commentator on the Bible. Got to know who Rashi is. And Rashi believes no superfluous words in the Torah. Rashi says the place in Egypt where our ancestors dwelled was the worst of the worst of the worst places in Egypt. Egypt at the time was the most decadent of all of the nations of the world, the most morally bankrupt of all the nations of the world, but the specific place where the Jews lived, the thorn hill of Egypt, was the worst of the worst. And not only that, the Canaanites, same thing. One of the most morally decadent places in the world, but the specific neighborhoods where the Jews lived were the worst of the worst. Why would Providence have it that our ancestors are living not only in a decadent nation, but in particular areas that are so negative and bad? Why would God have it that our ancestors dwelled in the worst places? It can't just be luck. It can't just be coincidence. Everything has a reason. And why would God be bringing them to Canaan to live in the worst of the worst neighborhoods in Canaan, to see such terrible immorality, confronting it up close in such a way? Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, the brilliant 20th century rabbi and philosopher, he answers this question in an essay where he discusses how one should react to negative surroundings. What do you do when all around you see a culture, you see relationships, you see a world that is heading in the completely wrong direction? You get why I'm bringing this forward to you. He says one of the greatest trials that a person has to undertake in their lives is guarding themselves against the dangers of negative people around them. He said, it's not just about the culture that you live in. It can apply to your home. You've got a spouse who's always complaining and always negative. It's really hard to guard yourself against that negativity. If you've got friends who are always complaining and negative, it's hard to be positive and maintain a hopeful disposition when all your friends are kvetching all the time. Applies to shuls, and it definitely applies to the wider community as well. It's really hard to stay focused and principled when others around you are negative or just don't care. But Rav Dessler says something very interesting. He says, if you're a strong enough person to withstand the ability of those negative forces to influence you, if you can be strong enough not to have those forces change who you are, then actually being in extremely bad surroundings can actually strengthen you. How so? Think about it. A society that's just a little bit bad, it can disguise and mask its negativity. It can even hide its negativity in very worthy pursuits. So a society that's just a little bit bad has an easier time attracting people and influencing people because people don't even know the Kool-Aid that they're drinking. But when a society is really, really, really bad, when it's filled with radicalism and violence and immorality, it can't hide anymore. Its corruption is much more obvious and evident. And even if you have only a little bit of intelligence, you will recognize it for what it is, and you'll stay away from it. Rabbi Dessler writes this: every time when there was a necessity for a righteous person, a tzaddik, to rise to an extremely high level, the tzaddik was flung to the lowliest and degenerate environments so that he could learn from them the lowliness of evil and strengthen himself in good to the opposite extreme. Quotes the story of Joseph, one of the most famous tzaddikim, righteous people in the Torah. Before he became righteous, think of all the trials that he had to go through. Stuck in the home of Potiphar, a home filled with immorality, Potiphar's wife going after him all the time. God wanted Joseph to see just how bad a household is where there are no rules, no morality, no order. And then as he grew older, Joseph, he might be able to grow in the opposite direction. I think this is brilliant. What Rav Dessler is saying is if you want to strengthen your Judaism, you want to strengthen your faith, you want to strengthen your observance, the best thing you can do is be surrounded by a world without any godliness in it whatsoever. To live in a world that's just a little bit bad, that's a spiritual challenge. But to live in a world that's really, really, really bad, that's a blessing. Isn't that crazy? I was really excited when I read this idea. I shared it with a friend of mine who's Catholic. He said, you know, this is true in the Catholic Church as well. For the Catholics who live in countries where everyone else is Catholic, they take their Catholicism for granted. But when you live in a country where Catholics are a minority, and more often than that they are persecuted, they don't take their Catholicism for granted anymore. They're much stronger in their faith. I think about the implications of this lesson to today. Rabbis like me have been warning about the decadence and the materialism and the moral bankruptcy of our culture for years. It's true. We've talked about the dangers of the secular agenda, about warped philosophies entering our schools, about the collapse of family and work and of traditional religion as pillars of Western society. But we have been kol koreh bamidbar, voices crying in the desert. Nobody seems to listen. And I think it's because there are also aspects of our culture that are worthy and just and very humanitarian. But nowadays, it's funny, we're having an easier time. More people are open to discovering Torah and Judaism. There's been a revival of interest of sorts in tradition. And I think it's because things have gotten so bad. The culture has descended to a level of depravity that's never been seen before. People are lonely and isolated and totally lost in life. Family life is falling apart, crime rates spiking, neighborhoods don't exist anymore. It's now evident that colleges and universities are centers of chaos and indoctrination and not education. Anti-Semitism all over the place. The notion of merit is under attack. And maybe the greatest indicator of all of hopelessness in our culture is the national birth rate, which is the lowest this year that has ever been recorded in Canadian history. People don't want to bring up children here, and they don't want to raise children here. The contrast between the world that we are living in now, the culture that is surrounding us, and the world of Torah, the culture of Torah, has perhaps never been greater, certainly not in our lifetimes. And as much as this is a challenge, I would submit to look at this as an opportunity. Hashem deliberately placed the Jewish people in Egypt so that they could develop an intense hatred of its impurity. And seeing the highly immoral behavior of the Canaanite nations, it was all in God's plan so that our ancestors would have their disgust intensified and it would heighten their appreciation of Torah. Do not perform the practices of the land of Egypt in which you dwelled, and do not perform the practices of the land of Canaan to which I bring you. See what the other people around you are doing, and know that we follow a higher calling. They destroy, we build. They hate, we love. They pursue the physical, we pursue the spiritual. They consume, we invest. They bow down to their idols, we bow down only before the King of Kings. And now we see it. No more masks, no more disguises. It's all as clear to us as the sky is blue. This is a great gift. So may we all merit to protect ourselves and our loved ones from negative influences in life, but even when we can't, when that's impossible, hopefully we can use this teaching to bring us closer to God, closer to our tradition, closer to Torah. Shabbat Shalom.